Chapter 1 of C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Book 1 of the Chronicles of Narnia. Lucy looks into a wardrobe. Once, there were 4 children, whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. Why were they sent away from London?
Air raids.
Air raids? Why? What was that?
Down, they're dying.
What's air raids?
What World War was this? World War II.
What's air raids?
Air raid, when they get bombed.
It's when planes go over and drop all their bombs on.
Yep. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife and lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready and 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty. But they do not come into the story much. He himself was a very old man with shaggy white hair, page 2, which grew over most of his face as well as on his head. They liked him almost at once. Can you imagine being greeted at the door by this old white-haired guy with long hair going everywhere, with big long beard? It'd be kind of freaky, wouldn't it? Okay.
Awesome.
But he's like the old
Santa.
The old professor. But on the first meeting, when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him. And Edmund, the next youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep pretending he was blowing his nose to hide it. As soon as they had said goodnight to the professor and gone upstairs on the first night, the boys came into the girls' room, and they all talked it over. We've fallen on our feet, and no mistake, said Peter. This is going to be perfectly splendid. The old chap let us do anything we like. I think he's an old dear, said Susan. Ah, come off it, said Edmund, who was tired and pretended not to be tired, which always made him bad-tempered. Don't go on talking like that. Like what? Said Susan. Anyway, it's time you were in bed. Try and talk like mother, said Edmund. And who are you to say when I go to bed? Go to bed yourself. Hadn't we better all go to bed, said Lucy. There's sure to be a row for her talking here. No, there won't, said Peter. I'll tell you on this sort of house, there's no one's going to mind what we do. Anyway, they won't hear us. It's about 10 minutes walk from here down to that dining room, and any amount of stairs and passages in between. What's that noise? Said Lucy suddenly. It's a far larger house than she had ever been in before, and the thought of all those long passages and rows of doors leading into empty rooms began to make her feel a little creepy. It's only a bird, silly, said Edmund. It's an owl, said Peter. There's going to be a wonderful place for birds. I shall go to bed now. And I say, let's go and explore tomorrow. You might find anything in a place like this. You see those mountains as we came along? And the woods? There might be eagles. There might be stags. Stags are large deer. There'll be hawks. Badgers, said Lucy. Snakes, said Edmund. Foxes, said Susan. But the next morning came. There was a steady rain falling, so thick that when you looked out of the window, you could see neither the mountains, nor the woods, nor even the stream in the garden. Of course it'd be raining, said Edmund. They had just finished breakfast with the professor, and were upstairs in the room he had set apart for them. A long, low room, with 2 windows looking out in one direction and 2 in another. Do stop grumbling, Ed, said Susan. 10 to 1, it'll clear up in an hour or so. And in the meantime, we're pretty well off. There's a wireless, a radio, and lots of books. Not for me, said Peter. I'm going to explore in the house. Everyone agreed in this, and that was how the adventures began. It was the sort of house you never seemed to come to the end of, and it was full of unexpected places. The first few doors they tried led only into spare bedrooms, as everyone had expected that they would. But soon they came to a very long room full of pictures, and there they found a suit of armor. And after that there was a room all hung with green, and a harp sat in one corner, and then 3 steps down and 5 steps up, and then kind of a little upstairs hall, and a room that led out onto a balcony. And then a whole series of rooms that led into each other and were lined with books. Most of them were very old books, some bigger than a Bible in church. And shortly after that, they looked into a room that was quite empty, except for one big wardrobe. There was the looking glass in the door. There was nothing else in the room, all except a dead blue bottle on the windowsill. "Nothing there," said Peter. They all trooped out again, all except Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it would be worthwhile trying the door of the wardrobe, even though she felt almost sure it would be locked. To her surprise, it opened quite easily, and 2 mothballs dropped out. Looking into the inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and feel of fur. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew it was very foolish to shut oneself into any wardrobe. Soon she went further in and found that there was a second row of coats hanging up behind the first one. It was almost quite dark in there. Page 6. And she kept her arms stretched out in front of her so as not to bump her face into the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further in, then 2, or 3 steps, always expecting to feel the woodwork against the tips of her fingers. But she could not feel it. This must be a simply enormous wardrobe, thought Lucy, going still further in and pushing the soft folds of the coats aside to make room for her. Then she noticed there was some crunching under her feet. What would you do right now? If all of a sudden you were going in this wardrobe and you kept walking your head, your hand out in front of you, and there ain't nothing, you ain't stop it. Would you keep going?
No, step back.
Baby.
All right. Okay. Shh. But the feeling of the hard, smooth wood of the floor of the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery and extremely cold. What do you think that is? Snow.
He skipped on.
Okay, that's all right. This is very queer, she said. Went on a step or 2 further. Next moment, she found what was rubbing against her face and hands was no longer soft fur, but something hard and rough and even prickly. Why, it's just like branches of trees, exclaimed Lucy. Then she saw there was a light ahead of her. Not a few inches away, where the back of the wardrobe ought to have been, but a long ways off. Something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later, she found that she was standing in the middle of a wood at night time, with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very inquisitive. What's inquisitive? Anybody tell me what inquisitive means? Curious? Be curious. And excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder there. Between the dark tree trunks, she could see the open doorway of the wardrobe, even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had set out. She had, of course, left the door open, for she knew it was a very silly thing to shut oneself into a wardrobe. It seemed to be still daylight there. I can always get back if anything goes wrong, thought Lucy. She began to walk forward, crunch, crunch, over the snow, and through the woods towards the other light. Would you go forward, or would you have stayed?
Forward.
I went.
Knowing what happens,
Would you go ahead and walk forward into a place you've never been before? This magical wardrobe?
it's not magical.
It sure is, because it's only 2 feet deep, and you're suddenly being able to walk forever, it seems like.
No, we just took the wall.
It's a portal. Okay. In about 10 minutes, she reached it. So she had to walk about 10 minutes to get to this light. And it was a lamppost. As she stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamppost in the middle of a wood, and wondering what to do next, she heard the pitter-patter of feet coming toward her. And soon after that, a very strange person stepped out from among the trees into the light of the lamppost. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white, page 7, with snow. Page 8. From the waist upwards, he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat's. The hair on them was glossy black. Instead of feet, he had goat's hooves. He also had a tail. But Lucy did not notice this at first, because it was neatly caught up over the arm that held the umbrella, so as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler, a scarf, around his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a strange but pleasant little face with short pointed beard and curly hair. And out of this hair there stuck 2 horns, one on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I have said, held the umbrella. In the other arm he carried several brown paper parcels. With the parcels and snow, it looked as if he had just been doing his Christmas shopping. He was a fawn. And when he saw Lucy, he gave such a start of surprise he dropped all of his parcels. "Goodness gracious me!" he exclaimed to the fawn.